The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of a double shift. I remember exactly where I was standing in the break room, half a cup of cold coffee in my hand, wearing scrubs that still smelled like the antiseptic from the overnight hours. My phone buzzed on the table and I almost didn't pick it up. I almost let it go to voicemail. I think about that sometimes. How different everything might have felt if I had just let it ring. It was my mother. She didn't say hello. She said, "Your father and I need you home tonight. After your shift. Don't be late." That was it. She hung up before I could ask why. I was 28 years old. I had been a licensed physical therapist for 3 years, renting a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus with a lease in my name and a savings account I had built from scratch. I was not a child who needed to be summoned. But something in her voice made me go anyway. That flat, controlled tone she used when she had already made a decision and was only informing you of it after the fact. I drove to my parents' house after my shift ended at 7. My father was sitting in the armchair by the window when I walked in. My mother was standing near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Neither of them hugged me. Neither of them offered me anything to eat or drink. I had been on my feet for 11 hours. I sat down on the couch and looked at them and said, "What's going on?" My mother said, "We know about Daniel." I felt the floor tilt. Daniel was not my boyfriend. He had never been my boyfriend. Not officially. Not in any way I had named out loud. He was someone I had been seeing for 7 months, quietly, carefully, in the way you do when you are not quite sure what something is yet. He was a doctor at the hospital where I worked. He was also, I had found out 3 weeks earlier, engaged to someone else. I had ended things the same night I found out. I had not told anyone. I had been processing it alone, the way I processed most things. But that was not the part my parents knew about. My mother said, "We know you're pregnant." I had found out 5 days before that phone call. 5 days. I had not even fully absorbed it myself yet. I had taken 3 tests, stared at each one for a long time, and then put them all in a paper bag and shoved it under my bathroom sink, like that would buy me time to figure out what I actually felt. I said, "I was going to tell you." My father said, "When? After you started showing? After you embarrassed this family in front of everyone we know?" I looked at him. I had not expected warmth exactly, but I had not expected that word either, embarrassed. As if that was the thing that mattered. My mother said, "You need to understand that we cannot support this. We will not support this. Not financially, not in any other way. If you choose to continue this pregnancy, that is your choice to make. But we are telling you right now that we are done." I said, "Done." She said, "Done. You are not welcome here. We won't be taking your calls. We won't be at any appointments. We won't be involved with anything that comes from this." My father looked out the window while she said it, as if the conversation was already over. I sat there for another few seconds, waiting for one of them to change their faces, to soften, to show me something I recognized. They didn't. My mother walked back into the kitchen. My father picked up the remote. I stood up and walked out. I sat in my car in the dark driveway for a long time. Not crying, not yet. Just sitting with this enormous quiet that had settled over everything. I was pregnant. The father wanted nothing to do with me. And my parents had just told me I no longer existed to them. And I had to be at work in 12 hours. I called my sister. She picked up on the second ring, which was typical. She had always been faster at answering than anyone I knew. Her name is Claire, and she is 4 years older than me. And she had been living in the same city as our parents her whole life, in a house 3 blocks away, in the kind of proximity that had always made me feel like I was the odd one, the one who had gone further than necessary. I said, "Claire, something happened." She said, "Pull out of Mom and Dad's driveway first. I can see your headlights from my living room." I pulled out. I drove to the end of the street and parked under a streetlight and told her everything. The pregnancy, Daniel, the conversation in the living room, the word embarrassed, the way my mother had walked back into the kitchen. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come here." I said, "I don't want to intrude." She said, "Maya, come here right now." I drove the 3 blocks. She was standing on her front porch when I pulled up, still in her work clothes, holding the door open. She had a job in accounting, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that required her to be at a desk by 8 every morning, and she had clearly not been home long. There was still a work bag on her entry table when I walked in. She hugged me before I could say anything else. I cried then. I cried in a way I had not let myself cry yet, the kind that starts somewhere behind your sternum and moves up in a way you can't control. She made me tea. She sat across from me at her kitchen table, and she didn't give me advice right away. She just let me talk until I ran out of things to say. Then she said, "You're not going back to that apartment tonight. You're staying here." I said, "Claire, you have a one-bedroom." She said, "I have a couch that folds out and clean sheets in the closet." I said, "I have work tomorrow." She said, "And I'll drive you. Stop arguing with me." I stayed that night. And the night after that. And when it became clear over the following week that my parents were not going to soften, that they were not going to call, that the silence was real and intentional, Claire was the one who said, "You should just stay. Until you figure out your next step. There's no reason to pay rent on that apartment while you're dealing with this." She meant it practically. She was like that. She approached problems the way she approached spreadsheets, by removing the unnecessary costs first and building from what remained. But the practicality was wrapped around something else, something that I did not fully understand until later, when I had more distance to look back with. She was scared for me. Not of me. Not of the situation in the way my parents were scared, with their concern for appearances and their careful management of how things looked. She was scared in the way you get scared when someone you love is standing too close to something with an edge. She wanted me where she could see me. I sublet my apartment. I moved my essentials into Claire's spare closet. I slept on the fold-out couch, which was not comfortable but which I was too exhausted to care about most nights. Because the first trimester was exactly as brutal as everyone says it is, and nobody tells you that being a healthcare professional doesn't protect you from any of it. I knew exactly what was happening to my body, and I still spent 3 weeks feeling like I had been turned inside out. Claire drove me to my first OB appointment. She sat in the waiting room and she didn't say anything about it being odd that she was the one there, and not a partner, not a parent. She just handed me my insurance card when I forgot it in the car, and told me to text her when I was done. She drove me home and made dinner. She did this without being asked, without making it a production, without sending my mother passive-aggressive updates. She just did it. Every evening she came home from her accounting job and made dinner for 2. She reorganized the bathroom storage to make room for my prenatal vitamins. She researched second-hand baby furniture in a spreadsheet, because of course she did, and sent it to me with columns sorted by price and condition. I tried to contribute. I paid a portion of the utilities since I wasn't paying rent anywhere. I took over grocery runs. On weekends I cleaned the apartment while she worked overtime at her desk, because her workload had increased in the spring, and she was putting in hours she didn't talk about much. I found out later, much later, that she had quietly declined a promotion during those months. The new role would have required her to transfer to the firm's Chicago office. She had been working toward it for 2 years. She never mentioned it to me. She just told her manager she wasn't able to relocate right now, and went back to her desk. I didn't know any of that while it was happening. I only knew that she was there, every morning, every evening, steadier than anything else in my life had been in a long time. Harper was born in November, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and an expression of extreme skepticism that the nurses found hilarious. Claire was in the delivery room. She held my hand through the hard part, and she cried when Harper came out, which surprised me because Claire is not a person who cries easily. She stood there with her hand over her mouth, and tears running down her face, and she looked at me and said, "She's perfect, Maya. She's absolutely perfect." I looked at my daughter and I thought, "You are the only thing that has gone right in 8 months," and somehow that was not a sad thought. It was just true. The first year was hard in the way that first years are hard, which is to say completely, and without mercy. I went back to work after 6 weeks because I had to, because my short-term disability only covered so much, and the math did not work otherwise. Claire had already rearranged her schedule so she could do daycare drop-offs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had not asked me if this was what I wanted. She had just looked at the logistics and assigned herself the part that made the most sense. Daniel reached out twice. Once when Harper was 2 months old, a text that said he'd heard and wanted to talk. Once 3 months after that, a longer message about wanting to do the right thing. I forwarded both to the family lawyer my colleague had recommended. I was not interested in what he wanted. I was interested in what Harper was entitled to, which was different. The legal process took 11 months. My lawyer was patient and precise. Daniel's lawyer was expensive and eventually useless. When it was resolved, the back payment came to $44,800, and the ongoing monthly support was set at $1,400. I sat in my car outside my lawyer's office after the final call and stared at those numbers on my phone. I called Claire from the parking lot. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "It's done." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Good. Come home. I'm making your favorite." She made chicken piccata. We put Harper in her bouncy seat on the kitchen floor, and we ate, and we didn't talk about the legal case or Daniel or any of it. We just ate and watched Harper stare at the ceiling fan with that look she had, that deeply serious look, as if the ceiling fan required her full analytical attention. I said, "I've been looking at apartments." Claire nodded. She already knew this. I had been quietly researching for a few months, once the finances started to stabilize. I said, "There's a 2-bedroom near work. Good school district, even though that's years away. It's more than I was paying before, but it's manageable now." She said, "When's the showing?" I said, "Saturday." She said, "I'll come with you." She did. She walked through every room with me and asked the property manager questions I would not have thought to ask about water pressure and the age of the appliances and whether the parking situation was assigned. She stood in the second bedroom, the one that would be Harper's, and she looked at the window and the light coming through it, and she said, "This one." I signed the lease 2 weeks later. I want to be clear about something. Moving into my own place was not the end of anything. It did not reduce what Claire had done. She had given me a place to land when the ground had been taken out from under me. She had rearranged her own life, without once making me feel like a burden, or a charity case, or a problem she was managing. She had shown up in the way that only a few people in your life ever actually show up, without fanfare, without keeping score, without asking you to be grateful in any particular way. I was grateful anyway. I was grateful in a way that did not have a clean way to express itself. I tried. I took her to dinner on her birthday at a restaurant she had been wanting to try for a year. I paid for her car registration when hers came due, and she was short after an unexpected expense. On the anniversary of Harper's first month home, I framed a photo from that night, Claire holding Harper in the hospital room, both of them with their eyes half closed and their expressions identical, and I left it on her desk without a note, because we were not the kind of family that needed a note. She texted me a photo of it on her desk. Just the photo. No caption. That was enough. Harper was 18 months old when I got comfortable enough with the new routine to feel like I had actually figured something out. She was walking, which was wonderful and exhausting in equal measure. She said 8 words, 4 of which were variations of no. She had her aunt's focus and her father's eye color, and something entirely her own in the way she moved through a room, deliberate and curious, like she was cataloging everything. I had a good team at the clinic. I had a friend group again, small but reliable. I had a savings account that was real this time, not just a number I was trying to maintain. I had Harper's daycare sorted and a pediatrician I trusted and a routine that mostly worked. I had gotten used to not thinking about my parents. That is a strange thing to get used to. For the first several months, I had thought about them constantly, an involuntary and useless mental habit, replaying the conversation in their living room, trying to locate the version of events where it went differently. After Harper was born, I thought about them less but more intensely, in the specific way of thinking about an absence the grandmother Harper would not have, the grandfather, the family photos that would have a gap in them. By the time Harper was walking, I had settled into something that was not acceptance exactly, but was its practical equivalent. They had made their choice. I had made mine. We were living with both. My phone rang on a Sunday afternoon. I was on the floor with Harper, sorting through a plastic bin of blocks, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up without looking at the screen and said hello. My father said, "Maya." I went very still. Harper held up a yellow block and looked at me with enormous expectation. I took it from her automatically and turned it over in my hand. My father said, We'd like to come see you, if that's something you'd consider. I said, Why? He said, A lot has happened. Your mother and I have done a lot of thinking. That was not an answer to my question. I noticed that, I said, I need to think about it. He said, Of course. Take whatever time you need. I called Claire that evening after Harper was asleep. I stood on my small balcony in the dark and told her about the call. She listened the whole way through. Then she said, What do you want to do? I said, I genuinely don't know, she said. Then, you don't have to know yet. You can wait until you do. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I thought about Harper, which is where all the hard questions eventually led now. I thought about what I wanted her to understand when she was old enough to understand things, about forgiveness, and about what you require from people before you let them back. I thought about what I had needed from my parents when I was sitting on their couch in borrowed time, how simple it would have been for them to choose differently, and how far-reaching the cost of not choosing differently had been. I called my father back. I said, You can come. Sunday. 2 hours. He said, Thank you, Maya. I said, Don't thank me yet. I told Claire they were coming. She offered to be there. I told her I wanted to do it alone first. She said okay, but she was leaving her phone volume on high. They came on a Sunday afternoon, the same day of the week my father had called, which I noticed and didn't say anything about. My mother was carrying flowers, tulips, the kind you buy at a grocery store on the way somewhere. My father had gotten a haircut recently. They both looked older. That stopped me for a second, seeing how much time had moved across their faces in a year and a half. I opened the door and let them in. Harper was in the living room. She looked at them with her cataloging expression, that steady, evaluating look. My mother's face went through several things at once. Her breath caught. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She looked at Harper the way you look at something you almost missed, the way your eyes adjust when you realize how close the edge was. My father stood very still. I said, Her name is Harper. My mother crouched down to Harper's level. Harper looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to her toy bin, with great purpose, selected a blue block, and walked it back to my mother, and handed it to her. My mother took the block with both hands like it was something important. Her eyes were wet. My father looked at me. He said, I owe you a real apology. Not a phone apology. A real one. I said, I know. He said, We were wrong. I don't have an explanation that makes it better. I only have that we were wrong, and we knew it before we admitted it, and that time is something we can't get back. I looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. I said, Claire was there. For everything. The delivery, the first night home, all of it. She turned down a promotion she had worked 2 years for because it would have moved her to Chicago, and she didn't want to leave while I needed her. I didn't even know that until 3 months ago. My father was quiet. I said, If there is going to be something here, it is going to be slow. It is going to be on Harper's terms, and mine. And it is going to come with the understanding that when things were hard, you left, and that doesn't disappear because you showed up after. My mother said, We understand that, I said. Claire is more Harper's family than you are right now. That is the truth, and I need you to sit with it. My father nodded once. His jaw was tight, but he nodded. We sat in the living room for 2 hours. Harper climbed onto the ottoman and fell off it, which she did constantly, and which never seemed to bother her. My mother watched her with an attention that was almost painful to see. My father held a conversation with me for the first time in a year and a half, and it was careful and short on both sides, and it was enough for a first time. When they left, my mother stopped at the door and turned back. She looked at me and said, She looks like you when you were small. Exactly like you, I said. I know. She nodded and walked out. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Harper came toddling in from the living room and raised her arms at me in the universal demand to be picked up. I picked her up. She patted my cheek twice with her open palm, which was her current affectionate gesture, and then looked toward the kitchen because she had apparently decided it was snack time. I texted Claire. I said, They came and went. It was hard and okay. You were right that I should do it alone first. She replied, Proud of you. Dinner Wednesday? I said, Yes. Harper wants to see you anyway. She keeps saying your name wrong in a way that sounds like it could be your name. She sent back a string of heart emojis, which was extremely unlike her, which told me she was more relieved than she wanted to say. I put Harper down in the kitchen and got her a snack and stood at the counter for a minute, looking out the window at the afternoon light on the parking lot. I thought about the last 2 years. The fold-out couch, the prenatal vitamins on Claire's bathroom shelf, the way she had stood in the delivery room with her hand over her mouth, the Chicago job she hadn't taken, the spreadsheet of secondhand furniture. I thought about my parents in my living room, older and smaller than I remembered them, watching a child they almost chose to never know. I thought about the difference between the people who stay and the people who leave, and how much of your life is shaped by which category the people around you fall into, and how you don't always get to choose, but sometimes, in the small decisions you make every day, you are choosing anyway. Harper held up a piece of cracker and offered it to me with great seriousness. I took it. I said, "Thank you." She said, "No," and took it back, because she was 18 months old, and no was her primary mode of expression. And I laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what I had built,